morning. My name is Alejandro Estefan. I am an assistant professor of development economics at the Keough School of Global Affairs of the University of Notre Dame. Today, I'll talk about one of my lines of research on public finance and economic development. And I titled this talk, Funding Public Goods in Developing Countries. My research is inspired by the observation that tax revenues are much lower in developing countries than they are in advanced economies. Previous work has shown that low and middle income countries raise between 10 and 20% of GDP in the form of tax revenues on average every year, whereas high income countries raise on average 40% of GDP. Now, this gap is important because taxation is the main source of revenue for governments to provide public services to their citizens. And from an international development perspective, this gap is important because self-reliance on tax revenues helps developing countries reduce their dependence on international aid. My research question, broadly understood, is how can local governments use the tools at their disposal to raise tax revenues and improve service provision in low and middle income countries? And so I focus on tools like tax rates, enhanced enforcement, boosting of tax morale, the use of meters to measure water consumption, and so on. And so to illustrate my research, I will show you first the results from our research project on property taxation in Mexico City that I conducted together with co-authors from the World Bank, Duke University, and the Ministry of Finance of Mexico. And so we chose Mexico City because we believe it is a perfect setting for the study of this type of question. First, Mexico City is the second largest city in the Western Hemisphere, which means that it is an important case of study. Second, the property tax is the second most important local tax after the payroll tax for the local government, which means that tax revenues from this source are an important source of funding for the government. And then third, 40% of taxpayers are delinquent. And this is a typical observation for a developing economy. The way we approach this question is by gathering data on the universe of residential properties in the city between 2008 and 2013. These data includes information like tax ID, the bill amount or the liability of the taxpayer, and taxpayer payments, including the payment amount and the payment date. We use this data to construct a couple of outcome variables that we believe are important. The first of them is payment amount, and the second one is the compliance share of the taxpayer, namely the ratio of payment to her gross liability. We use this data to measure the impact of two different policy tools. The first of them are tax rate hikes that were implemented in this time period by the government and applied only to a subgroup of taxpayers and did not apply to another subgroup. And so the fact that these were specific to a subgroup of the population allows us to identify the impact of these higher tax rates on payment behavior of taxpayers. And the second policy tool that we use, that we examine, is the impact of enhanced enforced measures. And so the way we do this is we conduct a field experiment through which we submit letters to delinquent taxpayers and see how those letters affect their payment behavior. First, I'd like to show you the results from our analysis of the impact of tax rate hikes on payment. Okay, and so in this graph, you'll see two panels. Panel A shows the results from the tax rate hike implemented in 2010, and panel B shows the results from the tax rate hike implemented in 2011. On the x-axis of each graph, you'll see time. So this is the year, ranging between 2008 and 2012. And on the y-axis, you'll see the mean payment of different groups of taxpayers relative to their pre-treatment mean, right? And so, what by this I simply mean the average amount paid by taxpayers in each group before the tax rate hike. And so if we focus on the left-hand side panel, you'll see that there is a vertical line between the years of 2009 and 2010. This vertical line represents the moment of the implementation of the tax rate hike. The red line in this graph represents the mean payment behavior of members in the treatment group, namely individuals that were exposed to the tax rate hike in 2010. Whereas the blue line represents the average payment behavior or the mean payment behavior for individuals that were not exposed to the tax rate hike. And so what you can see in the graph is that up until the moment of the implementation of the hike, payment behavior in both groups is exactly the same. Then, after 2010, a gap opens between the two groups and remains open up until 2012. Now, we quantify the size of this gap to be 13.4%, which means that the tax rate hike increased payment in the treatment group by 13.4% relative to the control group. On the right-hand side panel, you'll see a similar exercise, but for the tax rate hike implemented in 2011. As you can see, after the moment of treatment in 2011, a gap opens between the group of properties that were exposed to the tax rate hike and the group of properties that were not exposed to it. And we quantify this gap to be of 16.7%. Now, the takeaway from this graph is that the government can raise tax rates and increase tax revenue. And so tax rates are a possible tool or a viable or a feasible tool for the government to raise tax revenues.